The PlayStation Vita is a criminally underrated piece of mobile gaming hardware. Half a decade before anybody even heard of the Nintendo Switch, Sony was giving gamers near PlayStation 3 levels of graphics on a machine that could fit inside of your pocket. So you have to wonder, how come nobody bought any of these? I mean, I'll admit it, I slept on the Vita. I only bought this one a few months ago just to make this video. And even Sony gave up on the Vita just 3 years after its North American release. So today, we are going to tear into the system, make some huge upgrades to it, do a bit of deferred maintenance, and answer that question of what went wrong with the PS Vita. The first thing that we're gonna upgrade on this Vita is its storage. And this is almost certainly something that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way when the Vita first launched. You see, the Vita, initially anyways, had no internal storage, but it did have external storage that you could purchase directly from Sony. And you guessed it, it was both proprietary and really expensive. To get 32 gigabytes of storage, you had to add approximately 30 to 40% to the Vita sticker price. Luckily, in 2025, we have a much better option. This is the SD to Vita, and it allows you to insert a regular old SD card into the Vita's game card slot. Now, there is a slightly better option that we'll discuss later, but for the low cost of like 40 bucks, we now have 256 gigabytes of internal storage for our Vita, which is obviously a huge upgrade. But we can't use it just yet. In order to fully utilize our new storage, we are going to need to hack our Vita. Thankfully, in 2025, that's extremely easy to do. You don't even need a computer. I only plugged mine in because my battery is on its last legs. Basically, what I'm doing here is using a security exploit in the Vita's web browser to push a custom firmware onto the system. This removes a lot of Sony's built-in guardrails, opens things up, and gives the end user a lot more freedom, which is something that I think a lot of people would have appreciated back when this system first launched. But getting back to the topic of storage, one of the many benefits of hacking your Vita is that it allows you to configure the SD to Vita as the system's main memory. It'll also allow us to do things like install custom themes, overclock the system for huge improvements in performance, and rip games directly to the system so that we don't need to carry around game cards anymore. There's also a ton of other stuff that it lets you do, and we'll explore that later. But remember a second ago when I said my battery was on its last legs? Well, yeah, let's tear into the Vita and see if we can do something about that. One important thing that I forgot to mention earlier is that this is a first-gen Vita 1000. And if you're an enthusiast, this is the version that you want to get. The later 2000 models, often called Slims, are slightly thinner, but have worse build quality and are missing that show-stopping feature that really set the Vita apart when it first launched. That's right, I'm talking about the OLED screen. Even today, it's an impressive spec, but back then, it was completely unheard of. And I think what probably happened here is that the 1000s were a little too expensive to produce, and Sony tried to pass off a costed down second generation as an upgrade, which is not a good look and probably hurt the system's reputation long term. So now that we've got the system torn down, let's take a closer look at this battery. Rated at 2200 milliamp hours, back in its prime, this thing was good for 2 to 4 hours of playtime. Today though, after many years of degradation, I'm lucky to get 30 minutes out of it. So I went in search of a more modern replacement, and honestly, I didn't find much that would fit inside that same space. But here's where we can reframe a big mistake on my part as a bit of a win. See, I thought I bought a special 3G version of the Vita that has its own cellular modem. Now, I don't actually care about the modem, but you can use the port that it plugs into for one of these, a PSV SD. This allows you to install an SD card internally in your Vita and frees up that game card slot. Unfortunately, you can't install it on a non-3G version, which is what I actually bought, so yeah, I wasted 20 bucks on this adapter. But on the bright side, that means that there's a lot more free space inside this Vita. By my calculations, with a bit of trimming, there's just enough space for the battery from a Samsung S23 Ultra. All right, so I have the battery ordered, and obviously we're gonna need to modify it once it arrives, but while we wait for it to ship, there's actually a few other things that I wanna do to my Vita. And I actually made something that's gonna make all of that work a lot safer. I'd like to introduce you to what I call the vacuum. Pretty soon we're going to be doing some soldering, and the fumes from that can be quite dangerous. So I designed my own 3D printable solder extraction fan. Simply take an off-the-shelf Noctua fan, combine it with an activated charcoal filter, and boom, you've got yourself a high-performance fume extractor that's considerably cheaper than any store-bought alternatives. Plus, it uses a Noctua fan, so you know it's going to be way quieter. I used one of their 5-volt fans, so it comes with this little USB adapter, and that means that it can be powered by any USB port, including a battery bank if you want to take it on the road with you. So if you want to print your own at home, just scan the QR code on screen or check out the link down in the video description. All right, so now that we have our extractor all set up, let's keep tearing into the Vita and keep going with some of our mods. Back when the Vita first launched, micro USB was gearing up to celebrate its 5th birthday. So you can imagine how annoyed people were to find out that the Vita had its own annoying proprietary port. Today, we are going to correct that historical injustice by replacing it with a more modern USB-C port. But this mod is not for the faint of heart. To start, we need to fully remove all 3 of the Vita's PCBs. This requires removing half a dozen really delicate ribbon cables, a bunch of screws, and interestingly, these 3 metal reinforcement brackets. I wonder if these brackets are at least part of the reason that people think 1st gen Vitas feel so much better in the hand. With everything disassembled, we're going to set the left and right PCBs to the side, and we'll come back to them later because I have some upgrades planned for them as well. But for now, I want to focus on that central motherboard. The first thing we had to do is prep our patient for surgery. Here, I'm covering the entire motherboard in heat-resistant Kapton tape. This stuff will serve as a heat shield and protect everything except for that annoying proprietary port from getting blasted with really hot air. You see, that port is held in place by dozens of teeny tiny little solder points. So rather than trying to remove each one individually, I'm just melting them all at once, which allows me to lift the connector off a little something like this. A bit of cleanup removed any leftover solder, and then I was ready to install our new modern USB-C port. This thing was surprisingly cheap and came with everything that I'd need to install it. But that installation? Well, that's where things are going to get even harder. The first thing I did was position the new port so that it lined up with 4 holes on the Vita's motherboard. Technically, these are all grounding points, but their primary purpose is anchoring the new port in place so that it can withstand having a USB cable jammed into it over and over again. Now, because these ground points are all connected, they're really good at soaking up heat. So you can see that I actually switched to a chunkier soldering tip that has way more thermal mass, and that made soldering all these points a lot easier. With that done, I flipped the board over and grabbed my trusty digital microscope because the next connections we have to make are a lot smaller. Thankfully, there's only 3 of them though. This first one, labeled VCC, is responsible for delivering the 5 volts of power that it takes to charge the Vita. And all we had to do is connect it right here, which honestly wasn't too bad. But these next 2 lines are even smaller, and they're responsible for transmitting data to and from the Vita. I tried tapping the first wire into one of the Vita's data lines as it came out of this filter, but access was so tight that eventually I gave up and attached it on the input side where I had a lot more room to work. Practically, this should be fine, but it's worth mentioning that this isn't ideal because in effect, I'm skipping that filter and potentially hurting signal quality. Now, the final data line attaches down here where the original port used to be, but as you can see, I'm really threading the needle on this one, so I actually desoldered the other side of the wire and handheld it while I worked to give myself more control. After nearly an hour of soldering, I eventually got the job done, and our new USB-C port was ready for testing. And I'm also happy to report that the vacuum worked great on its first maiden voyage. I didn't smell any solder fumes at all. So now let's talk about sound. Remember the left and right PCBs from a second ago? Well, they're responsible for driving the Vita speakers. And man, do these things ever sound tinny and weak. So I want to see if we can replace them with something better. These are the speakers from a Nintendo Switch, and they're just about the perfect size to replace the stock speakers. With their bigger drivers and more modern design, they should be a big upgrade, but their installation wasn't as straightforward as I was hoping. After soldering them to the old contacts, I secured them in place using their included adhesive gaskets, and only when I went to test fit them did I discover that they were just a little bit too big for the Vita's rear shell. So I trimmed away at it using some mini side cutters and a craft knife, and eventually I created just enough space for the new speakers to fit. And then I test fit the main board only to realize that I also had to trim out a bit more plastic to make room for that new USB-C port. But after I did that, everything fit perfectly in place. All right, so now that we have our backplate trimmed, our new speakers and that new USB-C port are going to fit perfectly. And today I want to be a good boy and actually test that USB-C port before moving on to any other hard mods. But when we have the Vita all disassembled like this, there's actually a few other things that I want to take care of. Two of which I think are going to be really relatable to anybody who's ever owned a mobile console before. But first, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Ugreen and their new lineup of NAS solutions. If you're anything like me and have a bunch of data to store but hate paying monthly fees, you're gonna wanna listen to this. Ugreen sent over both their DXP 4800 Plus and the new DH 4300 Plus. And the first thing I was struck by was, well, just how cool looking both of these things are, but then also how these are the most beginner-friendly NASs that I have ever seen. Simply slot in up to 4 hard drives, run their configuration wizard, and you can access up to 120 terabytes of storage securely from anywhere in the world. Setup took less than 20 minutes, and I had my own personal cloud up and running. All my data is stored locally, so it's safe and secure, and I can share it with family and team members. For example, that's how my editor I edited the near 300 gigabytes of footage that it took to make the video you're watching right now. We both edited it off the same shared drive. And there's no need to worry about speed either. With full 2.5 gig networking built in, this NAS can reach download speeds of over 300 megabytes per second, which is way faster than anything you'll get from any cloud service. But don't worry, you can still sync files seamlessly between your Ugreen NAS and Google Drive. And it works across all my devices too, including my phone, which I can conveniently pair via NFC, which actually leads me to my favorite feature. This NAS has a built-in AI album assistant that organizes and classifies all my photos. Practically, what that means is that I can find specific photos with a simple keyword search. And don't worry, that all runs locally, so no one is creeping on all your personal photos. With either one of these NASs, you have access to fast, secure, and scalable storage that will end up being way cheaper than any cloud-based solution long term. I am very impressed with what Ugreen has managed to do here, and you can save 20% off both these NASs by checking out the link in the video description and using my special code. All right, that's enough about NASs. Now let's get back to the build at hand. Given that mobile consoles are literally handheld at all times, they tend to get covered in dirt, grime, and just general nastiness. So to fix that, I gave all the parts a good thorough cleaning with isopropyl alcohol. Not only will this make everything look new again, but cleaning the contacts and buttons can help them operate a lot more smoothly and fix issues with unresponsive inputs. Next, I want to turn your attention to my front screen. As you can see, this Vita has seen better days. Its soft plastic screen is completely covered in little scratches. So I want to try something that's worked really well for me with a lot of other devices. We're going to borrow some tools and products from the automotive world. This is polishing compound, and with the help of a polishing pad, it acts like a very fine sandpaper that removes the topmost layer of the Vita screen. This gets rid of all of those scratches, and then with progressively finer pads, we can polish the screen back to a high gloss finish. The final step, after removing any leftover compound with more isopropyl alcohol, is to seal the screen with a ceramic or graphene coating. This stuff forms a really slick, invisible layer on top of your screen and makes it a lot easier to clean. Just let it dry to a light haze and then buff it off. So the big question here is, how did it look when it was done? Well, the results are kind of mixed. The scratches are completely gone and the screen is a lot glossier, but that kind of highlights a lot of the dents on it that were either hidden before or perhaps caused by my overeager polishing. Like I said, the Vita screen is soft plastic, so it doesn't take much to dent it. Either way, I didn't want to leave the screen as is, so I decided to roll the dice on a replacement screen from China. At that price, I'm doubtful it's a real OLED, but we'll see in a couple weeks once it arrives. So while we wait for our growing list of parts, I want to solve one of the biggest ergonomic issues with this console. If you have larger hands the way that I do, the analog sticks on the Vita are really uncomfortable. They're teeny tiny and not particularly grippy. So I started tearing one down in hopes of finding a solution, and what I found is that these things are surprisingly complicated. So I guess it should come as no surprise that a search for Vita stick upgrades yields basically no results. But I did kind of find one. I found a single screenshot of a Vita that seemingly had a pair of analog sticks from a Nintendo Switch. Now, there were no instructions, and I knew it couldn't just be plug and play, so I think we're probably gonna have to MacGyver this one. I started by cutting the top off of a Switch's stick and then sanded it flat. I then peeled the rubber topper off of a Vita stick, and that revealed a surprisingly flat surface. I sanded that too, just to rough it up a bit, and then I brought out the super glue, which you might not think would be strong enough, but it's rated for over 4,000 PSI of tensile strength, so for an application like this, it's actually complete overkill. I gave that some time to cure, and then I painstakingly reassembled both the analog sticks, making sure to put them back just how I found them. And thankfully, they just fit through the front faceplate of the Vita. It's almost like they were designed for this. So with that, I was ready to reassemble the Vita and finally test my first round of mods. And this was a little bit of a roller coaster. Plugging in the Vita yielded a red charging indicator, which I was quite happy about. Charging indicator, that's a good sign. But for some reason, I couldn't get that drive to mount. I'm getting that like new device plugged in chime. Come on, show up as a drive. Oh, it's probably not showing up as a drive because I don't have any storage in it. But even that didn't fix it. In the end, it turned out to be a bit of basic troubleshooting that saved the day. All right, crisis averted, I figured out what it was. So I think it was either the USB cable or the port I was using, but when I plug it in with this different cable into a different port, it pops right up. So now we can test our speakers, and yeah, those are working, and they sound quite a bit better than the old ones. Now we'll do a full side-by-side comparison later, and also, our joysticks work great and they actually feel really nice. So we'll talk more about that stuff later. But for now, I think we should keep going with the mods because our new battery just arrived in the mail. Right off the bat, it needs to be said that what I'm about to do is extremely dangerous and should not be attempted by anybody at home. Lithium-ion batteries will explode violently if mishandled, so consider yourself warned. Our first step is going to be a bit of diagnostic work on our new donor cell. After unwrapping it just enough to expose the battery's tabs, I figured out which terminal was positive and which was negative. Then I dove back into the Vita to remove the factory battery, and here's where things start to get dangerous. If you look closely, you'll see that the factory battery actually has 3 wires coming off of it. That third wire is for a temperature sensor on the battery management PCB. It tells the Vita to shut off if the battery gets too hot, and without that signal, the Vita won't turn on. So we need to extract that board with the sensor from this battery. And unfortunately, this is an older style cell with really thick wrapping. So opening it up had me using more force and sharper tools than I'm normally comfortable with. Eventually though, I did get the BMS fully exposed and then carefully disconnected it from the cell. After removing what was left of the old cell's tabs, I was ready to attach it to the new cell, but not before giving the Zacuum a big upgrade. My friend Eric from Spenceley Design Co. gave me the good idea to include some threaded holes on the stand. That way you can mount it to a boom arm and create the, wait for it now, the fume boom. It's got both 1/4-20 threads and 3/8 threads, so it should screw directly onto most standard boom arms and tripods. So with the fume boom positioned directly over my work area, I was ready to do something else that's really dangerous: soldering the BMS board to our new cell. Soldering directly to battery tabs is not recommended because the heat can transfer through the tabs and cause a runaway reaction inside the cell that would, you guessed it, make it explode. So again, I'm working with a soldering tip that has a lot of thermal mass and trying to work as quickly as possible in order to limit how much heat I'm dumping into each contact. Thankfully, I got it done without any issues and proceeded to rewrap the BMS and the cell with Kapton tape and then electrical tape to prevent any shorts once it's installed back in the Vita. And here's a weird quirk of the Vita. There's actually a lot of empty space inside of it. So in order to get our new battery to fit, all I had to do was trim away at some of these plastic dividers. But that begs the question of how come Sony didn't install a bigger battery in this thing from day one? Seems like one of many missed opportunities that plagued the Vita. Anyways, after smoothing out all the sharp edges, I installed the new battery using a combination of really strong double-sided tape and, surprisingly, the factory battery retention clip. It still fit just fine even with our new battery. So now let's give it a test and see if our Vita even turns on with its new plus-size battery. Okay, here we go. Big moment of truth. See if she powers on. Not a good sign, nothing so far, but let me try plugging it in real quick. Okay, charging indicator is on. That's a good sign. Oh, come on, give me something. Yes! PlayStation logo. So now that we know that our new battery works, let me show you something that's completely out of chronological order. Weeks after I finished filming this video, my new screen arrived in the mail. So later, you're gonna see some B-roll where it's still all dented, and that's just because I filmed all that while I waited for this to arrive. But on a more positive note, I'm pretty sure I actually got a brand new replacement OLED screen for like 20 bucks. And I also got a more high-end ceramic coating that's specifically designed for screens. Hopefully that provides a bit of protection against future scratches. So after reassembly, here's a side-by-side comparison between the original screen and our new replacement. And now, with that last puzzle piece in place, let's get right into the testing. Of course, the big one is battery life. Our new battery delivers almost 6 hours on a single charge, and that's with the volume and screen brightness turned up and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth enabled. So that is probably right around double what the stock battery would have delivered. And truth be told, because I'm using the original battery's BMS, I'm not actually getting the full capacity of our new battery. That cell charges to 4.4 volts, but because we reuse the BMS from the original battery, which has a different chemistry, it cuts off charging at 4.2 volts. So really it's only charging to like 80 or 90% of its maximum capacity, which is actually really good for the health of the battery, and 6 hours of gaming is plenty for my needs. Now, that added battery life does come at a slight cost. A stock Vita weighs in at 260 grams, and this one is 277, which to me, honestly, just makes it feel more robust and premium in the hand. Next, I wanted to see if load times were affected by both our new overclock, and we'll talk more about that in a second, and the addition of our shiny new SD card. And the answer here is a resounding yes, anywhere from 20 to 25% depending on the game, which makes the system feel a lot more responsive and snappier. And I'm sure many of you are also curious about sound quality, so let's give a listen to what the stock speakers sounded like. And here are the new speakers. Honestly, it's not a huge difference, but they are about 4 decibels louder and have way more reach into the low end, which makes them sound a lot better. Now, the thumbsticks, on the other hand, are a bit more of a mixed bag. The one on the left, I absolutely adore. It feels so much better than the original stick, and honestly, it's just a pleasure to use. But the one on the right, well, I find that sometimes it kind of gets in the way of the X button. Now, that might just be a me thing with, my fat thumbs, but honestly, if I were to do this all over again, I might even rock an asymmetrical look where I replace the left thumbstick, but then keep the right one as is. Okay, so now let's talk performance with the overclock. The Vita has 3 main clock speeds which change depending on what game you're running. These are their normal ranges. And now, with the overclock enabled, we can go ahead and crank those up to these new values, which in some cases is a huge upgrade. So practically what that means is that every Vita game that used to struggle to run properly in the past now runs quite a bit better. Some of the standouts are Borderlands 2, the Jak and Daxter collection, and also Spider-Man. Now, an overclock like that comes at the cost of decreased battery life, so you can actually dial those settings in on a per game basis, but given our bigger battery, I've just been leaving them cranked at their max settings, and I've still been getting over 4 hours of game time and had no issues with thermals. And overclocking your Vita also helps in another area. Emulation. The Vita is actually a pretty awesome little emulation device. Not only can it just fully become a PSP with the menus and everything, but you can also play just about everything up to the PS1 and the N64. Technically, the Dreamcast is also possible, but it's a bit of a stretch for the Vita's hardware, especially at stock speeds. So as we end this video, I have one last question for all of you at home. If Sony had released this version of the PS Vita back in 2011, would you have bought one? Because I know that I definitely would. All of these small tweaks add up to a way more attractive package. However, there are still a few things that I would have done differently if I had to do this project again. And I've compiled all those thoughts into a separate bonus video that's available for channel members. So check that out if you're interested. Grab the 3D print files to create your own Zacuum at home, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.